Iain, you're the Work and Pension Secretary. Anybody you will notice that the motto of this conference, emblazoned absolutely everywhere, is for hard-working people. Now, it's got me wondering, what's about the chilled-out people? I mean, I'm thinking of mainly the Spectator readers. Who did like to take life a little bit easier. Do they deserve to stand for them?
You're going to be coming into these new attendance centres en masse. We will make you work 9 to 5. I know it'll be a shock, but it'll help you get a job in later life, I can tell you.
Okay, I think you've just lost 70,000 votes there. We'll see. But it's of course you are one of the very few people in the cabinet who do know what it's like not to be working hard, working at all. You've been on the dole, and I was wondering if you can say a bit more about your background, because at the moment most people, by and large, come into politics after going to some elite English secondary, going to PPE at Oxford, we've just got a lot to answer for in terms of the damage it's done to our country. And then becoming a special advisor, photocopying for a while, and then going on to do some politics. Some of them very successful photocopiers. But you're a rather unusual background. Your father was a Spitfire pilot. Your mother, if I'm right, was a ballerina. On growing up, how much did your family influence you? Did you dance?
I've never been any good at dancing.
Did you try?
In fact, the last time I think we really danced was, no, I better not get into that because Betsy said it was, well, we made an agreement. I would not ask her again, she wouldn't say no. So, it was that bad. But no, I not really, no, I think my mother was, it's all very wartime, the whole thing, because he had been pretty much fighting since 1940, and he was down in Italy at the time, and they'd given him a short period back in 1944 where he would command the base area of Naples, to give him some R&R really, because he'd been in combat pretty much for 4 years or 5 years, no, 4 years at that point. And my mother was sent out under Ensign, but with the Anglo-Polish ballet to dance, to tour for the troops. And she said it's quite interesting because when she went out, they did a I think performance of Swan Lake in the Royal Opera House in Naples, and she said it was astonishing, interesting side to side. But she said the audience was full of soldiers, not officers. It was actually full of ordinary soldiers who came and absolutely loved the whole idea of being transported by the music and everything else, and they took that back to England, which is why ballet after the war became suddenly a very big thing, and opera never quite made it in that same way. It's much more elitist, but ballet's not. And after the performance, she attended a party and she met my father, who was commanding there and having a whale of a time. He'd taken over, he'd commandeered a hotel in Sorrento, as you do.
That's pretty good. Come back to my hotel, I own it.
Yeah, it was. But he didn't quite, because she was going on tour, and then she didn't see him again for, 9 months, 10 months, and then she was just going into Shepherd's one evening with some friends who were going out to dinner in London back in 1945, and she was walking in and she just kind of blur, something caught her eye. She turned to the left and she just saw this figure that she knew and remembered. She just popped out and said hi, and the rest is history. It was actually a 5-second glimpse, and then they got married. So it was quite forgiving. So they were very romantic, I think.
But was your dad one of these soldiers who didn't mention the war afterwards, or did you grow up with him?
No, he didn't. He didn't really talk much about it. In fact, we asked him. I'm one of three boys and 2 girls, and the boys particularly we grew up with this idea about a few things, because you do that. I'm a generation where a lot of this stuff was kind of taken for granted because every father had been in the war. Most mothers had some interesting story to tell, so it kind of just became a backwash. It wasn't 2 things. One, we used to ask him lots of questions, and he told us a few things, but we didn't really have a very clear idea of what it was about. And he had 2 DSOs and 3 DFCs. He had 5 gallantry medals, which is slightly unusual as a high collection. But it didn't really occur to me that was in any way unusual, that most people would do something. It wasn't until I actually went in the army myself, when somebody asked about my father, and I mentioned 5 gallantry medals, there was a complete moment when they just said back to this is not possible if people don't get 5 gallantry medals. that I suddenly realised there might have been something special about his war activities. So we pressed him, and eventually he wrote a book called Spit Round the Battle, which even today is now still selling. It just sells and sells and sells. And it's sort of a rather good understated account of, life fighting, but also, what it is to deal with life and death and friends that you don't see anymore. It's a very good book.
And so you wanted to basically follow him into the military. When did you decide that this wasn't for you and politics was?
Well, I enjoyed it. I had fun in the army. I mean, it's a great place for a young man to go into if you want to make some friends, a bit of action, everything else. But I think quite early on I decided that I would rather be the instrument of policy. I more and more felt that I'd rather be making the rules rather than just simply running according to them. And the key was when I was in, I was sent out to what in those days was called Rhodesia, later on Zimbabwe, and we did the settlement. It was the first thing that Mrs. Thatcher did, if you remember, rather bravely in a strange way. When she went out, you remember she went out to the conference in, was it Lusaka, I think? And Carrington relayed that as she was on the aircraft, this is almost the first thing she did. She was so certain that the people hated her out in the Commonwealth that they would throw acid at her as she came down, and so she put some dark glasses on. He said, "Why are you wearing dark glasses?" Do you remember that Carrington said? Simply because she kind of had convinced herself, and he said, "Don't." And he said she was very brave because she had to overcome that fear. But it was from that moment onwards, and they did the Lancaster House Agreement, and I went out to with John Ackland, who's now dead, but he was commanding the Commonwealth Monitoring Force. I remember actually we had to fly. We were not given overfly rights because they decided to dispatch us early. The conference had hit a problem, so we were dispatched early, and we flew backwards to Rhodesia because the RAF fly you backwards. So we flew out by the Azores and the Central Islands, and then in over the previous strip. So it was about 20 hours, just trying, because none of Africa would give us overfly rights. And it was while I was there, implementing what was essentially a settlement, I just was convinced that I really needed to be in politics, not in the army anymore, and that really made my decision, and I eventually left about a year later after I got back.
And was it always the Conservatives for you?
Yeah, well, I don't think I even questioned it really. It's funny, isn't it? There may be some people kicking around when it was a bit of a decision, but not with me really. I mean, everything about Conservatives is very much where I am, this whole sense of aspiration, people being able to get on, keep more of their own, take their own decisions, that kind of freedom, that sense. And also, remember at that stage, Mrs. Thatcher was coming in, she started to change things in a way we never thought would be possible. It was really challenging and exciting. The Tory party actually was a very exciting party at that stage. Something that frankly you really wanted to be involved in. And actually we forget now that you remember the big rallies they used to have, and for young people, the halls would be full of Kenny Everett doing his ludicrous stuff, getting in trouble over it. Bizarre. But the halls were full of young people, so we forget how exciting Mrs. Thatcher, the Conservative Party, was at that stage, how terrible and dead the whole concept of socialism and Labour was in people's minds, associated with grey, strikes, problems, that sort of stuff. So, no, it was a very exuberant time to be a Conservative.
And you were the Shadow Welfare Minister under Haig, weren't you?
Yes, yeah.
And why so?
Well, out of nowhere, really, he asked me to do the job. And I hadn't been in the government before because I kept turning. I was a rebel, really, in my first 5 years.
So did you think that was it, out of darkness?
Well, I never, I was actually within a month and a half, 2 months, I think, of arrival, I had voted against the government on the Maastricht Treaty, which I discovered was faster than Churchill had managed it when he was, he had a pretty bad record. So I basically was a rebel, and then we'd fallen out about a few things, not William, etc. And then at the end, I was offered a couple of jobs as PBSs, and I turned those down, thinking, well, what's the point? Because I'm likely to be rebelling again, so I don't want to embarrass the government. It seems rather bizarre, you don't want to embarrass the government, but at the same time you're being a bit rebellious.
But you were asked to think about welfare under Haig, and you didn't come up with anything new as...
Well, I actually had, it's worth going back, I had started, it's very difficult if you start in opposition because it's quite difficult, but I made a speech, I remember this, men behaving badly was the thing, and I'd been out and seen a few places, and I reached the conclusion that there was a whole area here where we really weren't thinking about, which is there was a group in society who were being particularly bit by bit estranged from the rest of what you'd call normal life. And it was this whole breakdown of family life on the estates particularly, but in lower income groups, where men were sort of disappearing from the whole role of bringing up children. But more than that, because the state had stepped in so much and progressively more and more was replicating, the role of the breadwinner in the family, what you were getting was a growing number of broken families, or families where the women took after the children, and the men who should have been involved were no longer involved. In fact, they were becoming a bit of a menace in the estates, together in gangs, causing problems. So I remember making a speech saying, this is an area that we can't just deal with this in money terms, there's something going fundamentally wrong. And I just entitled it Men Behaving Badly, because that's basically what we're getting, is that they're now no longer, and the thing that would hold them to do the right thing would be the need to provide in that family, and bit by bit with the fall off in manufacturing and manual jobs, they were less and less involved in life, more and more loose out there and causing trouble. So it was early on in that time that I was trying to get people interested in the idea that we needed to do more work on this area. So I was already beginning to think that we had a fundamental structural problem rather than just a fiscal problem, as it was. I wasn't in the business of blaming my parents. I thought actually it was a problem that seemed to be caused hugely in part by us as a state with our mechanisms, and not just wholly people's fault for taking the wrong decisions.
That wasn't a critique which people associated with the Conservatives back in those days, and Haig certainly didn't succeed in articulating it. Where do you think he went wrong as a leader?
Oh no, I mean I have some sympathy really for William. We both sympathise with each other actually quite a lot. We swap. We occasionally meet and we swap stories about where did it all go wrong, and it tends to be about the same thing too really. The problem really is, first of all, we forget just how deep the fall for the party had been in 1997. I mean, it was astonishing. The whole party was at each other's throats and had fallen out. The end of Mrs. Thatcher was still a massive problem for the party. No one could get over the fact that she had been deposed. Were people still at each other's throats about her, about your role? I mean, I can remember, it's quite interesting, you'd still go into bits of Parliament and you'd be with Conservative MPs and there would be people who would be arguing about where they were the night that she had to go, who had done the dirty, who in the cabinet. I mean, it's quite interesting, that was still live.
I was in the pub last night, people were having the discussion.
Well, no one has ever dominated a political party in quite the way that she did, and her end dominated as much as anything else. So for William, really, I have to say, and I'm very supportive of William, it's very difficult to put a party together that still was not interested in trying to do it. So first of all, he had that big problem. I suffered some of that myself. But also, just trying to understand what it was that the vote for Blair had been about. So there were a lot of false starts in this. Was it because there was no need for a Conservative Party anymore? There was no need for a party who's got a right of centre anymore? Maybe it was all about crowding into this ground marked out by Tony Blair. So it took a while to figure out to what degree was Blair really occupying our territory, or was he just capable of making himself sound like he occupied the territory?
So you said that no need for a Conservative Party anymore. Were there moments where you did think that?
Not personally, but I do think that there was a lot going on. I think the media, and I think particularly the BBC, it was very. I remember sitting down with a group of producers and saying at the time, it is impossible sometimes to get on the airwaves as a Conservative. You'd rather get anybody else that's got a point to make, and all your critique for the Labour Party is existing of critique from the left. So Blair was more often, being criticised by people who hated what he was doing from the left.
So splits in Labour were crowning out the Conservatives.
Completely, and therefore, this was the idea that less and less were we relevant, to the extent that actually I had journalists saying, a Conservative conference, I've got to write something about it, I can't really be bothered, no one's interested in you people at all, have you got some tips or something you can say to me? And I remember being quite shocked by that actually, that was hold on a second, this is a viable political party. But the depth of our fall in 97 was astonishing. I don't think it's been mirrored at any other time. It was just so deep, and we've been recovering from that ever since. Right?
Yeah. Do you think to yourself that, had you stayed, let's say you stayed on as leader and were elected, as Prime Minister, would you have been able to achieve as much in the area of your interests in welfare reform as you've done as Working Pension Secretary?
Do you know, I don't. It's an almost impossible question to answer because I never really think about what might have been. I never genuinely don't. I just think, well, we didn't get that far, but I always felt this was the area that I needed to try and get the Conservative Party over. So I'd like to think that had I done that, then I would have been able to get them to that stage. But there may be an argument that said that maybe they weren't ready quite to focus on this at that stage anyway, and maybe it needed a bit more time, and maybe David Cameron there, it was easier to try and persuade them that this was the right kind of line to take. So, and I had, the Centre for Social Justice, if you think about it, the organisation here in general political terms, we use that time with the CSJ to create the debate, to create the evidence, to make the argument, and then eventually move all political parties onto this area. So to that extent, it could be argued it would have been very difficult, but certainly that's what I wanted.
And how important was your visit to Easter House in changing your system? Was it a kind of Thunderbolt and Damascene moments, or?
Well, I think journalists always like to write about this stuff because it makes much better copy, but actually it was part of a process of trying to understand what was going on and why it was failing. So it was very important in that respect, but then also I made some very good friends in Gallowgate, and there I saw some really big issues around drug addiction and family breakdown as well, in some cases a little more startling and really difficult. So, I made good friends elsewhere. It wasn't just there were other places I'd been. So it was part of a process of helping me to formulate in my own mind what I thought the problems really were. If you go back to the point I made earlier that I talked about men behaving badly, there was already a kind of seed of a concept and a thought that there was something in it. So it was a part of a process of understanding. And, I suppose it was important, but it was others were just as important in the sense of trying to build a picture of what I thought we had to do.
But what you did, perhaps the reason you set up the Centre for Social Justice was there was not really at the time a similar sort of movement in the Conservative Party itself, not really to speak of. People came to Tory Party conference not to go to fringes like these. They came to Tory Party conference for the violence, pretty much, just to see people getting beaten up.
At fringes like this.
Yes, fringes like this. But to what extent do you think have you had to persuade, I wouldn't say convert, but persuade the party that social justice is a conservative mission, if not the conservative mission?
I don't know if I've been responsible for persuading them. I never think that I have. I think that, I think this party occasionally forgets who it really is. Politics is such that when you get into power, you have to focus on the things that are important at that particular time. And for Mrs. Thatcher, when she came in 1979, it was a collapse in a sense of self-worth in the nation, a collapse in kind of the production, productivity, the economy.
It was the economic language.
So that was all there. And so the language about her, she had to focus and narrow the interest of the party to that area. So, but there's always been a strong tradition in the Conservative Party, historically, of actually making the right sort of changes to help improve, quality of life for people across the whole spectrum of society. So, although we narrowed to get that done, it was necessary to kind of get back the other bit of the party, which was also very important, and not assume that because you were interested in this area somehow that would make you soft. Quite the contrary, actually. It was to try and say that without this, the economics will never work unless we reform and change the social makeup, in the sense that we bring it back to the point where people again can play a full part in the economy and society. Then the economy will not work, and what we'll end up doing, which is what we started doing, was sucking more and more people from abroad, because your own base of people simply is not capable of providing the kind of economic support that you need. And so it was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy going on. It was a chance for the Conservative Party to occupy and know what the rationale was, but recognise that we're in the business of helping people, not ticking them off, lecturing them, or damaging them. So it was actually for a very positive reason. Disraeli and Wilberforce and Shaftesbury and Churchill, they were all conservatives. No one would look back on them and say, "Oh, I'm disgusted with that crowd," because they really gave a bad image to the Conservative Party. They should have been on pure economics. Well, none of them were, because they felt this is a balanced ticket.
What about Christianity? I mean, you're a Catholic. How important is that to you, and what is it, and what ways it shaped your thinking about social policy?
Well, I'm a Catholic, a Christian. I don't, bang on about it a lot because I think it plays a part in my personal life. But only it's very clear because with the guidelines, I'm debating Catholic social teaching, where they see that has a bit of an influence. I think the tendency is to see a lot of that from the left's perspective. My argument has been actually the Conservatives have as much right to be involved in that arena about the greater good and the well-being of families. And I think that does play a part. It plays a part and helps you to understand the sense of the fact that you're here, but you're just a small cog in it. I mean, you get your job done, you do what you can, but there are other forces around you that shape things as well. So it helps me to understand that and put myself in perspective and not feel at any stage as though I'm so important that what happens to me is more important than anything else. Now I try and take a wider view.
But it can lead to, the conservative Christian movements certainly is entangled in the creation of the Centre for Social Justice. And it can lead to some suspicions in other parts of the Conservative Party. That I'll read you a quote from Jan Ganesh's biography of George Osborne.
Yeah.
More of him later. Osborne questioned the analytical rigour of the Christian Conservatives who hovered behind universal credit. Quote, he thinks people pushing this are evangelicals, that they blind themselves to any downside. Many in the Treasury regard welfare reform as an unexploded bomb underneath the government. Then the critique there is that universal credit, that your reforms, isn't just a government policy. It's something which is regarded as a kind of mission by people who are religious.
Well, I don't actually agree about that. I mean, that again is part of the problem of politics, which is to see things in black and white. That it's either one thing or the other. Either, you are completely separated from this and we must be pure and avoid the whole idea of religion in politics, and the other side that says, religion is part of it. The two things intermingle and break. There are some things you do which aren't necessarily involved in Christianity and vice versa. So I think it's messianic. And was there a sort of messianic process about universal credit? No, only on the basis that we came to universal credit on the basis of how do you mend a system that is so complex, difficult and broken that nobody understands it. It acts as a disincentive, it traps people, holds people down and doesn't give them the ability to be able to move on up. Now, if I am a Christian or not a Christian, I don't see what difference it makes. The reality is that system needs sorting. Now the problem is, if you see it from a kind of governmental treasury perspective, as was at that stage, then the answer is incremental fiddling is what you do, because you deal with each problem as it gets too difficult, fiddle with it, adjust it, move on. We've been doing that for years. The result was massive complexity. I mean, in each benefit, there are all sorts of different addendas that add little bits from disability and everything else, and so it becomes so complex. So my argument with them was more with the Treasury hierarchy at that stage, and their sense of this was they were very reluctant to take this on, and felt that somehow you could manage your way through this, but we couldn't. And you only have to look at the wasted money on tax credits to realise to what extent it was no longer feasible, because the tax credit had almost broken the system. So no, it wasn't messianic in any kind of Christian sense. It's just a determination that once we'd done the work on this, we needed to drive this, because otherwise it would not succeed, and you want what you're doing to succeed, so that's where we're driving it.
But you can see why the Treasury had such reservations, because what you were proposing was nothing less than the complete overhaul of a system that governs pretty much the lives of about 5 million people. I mean, this wasn't reform, this was perestroika. This was, you were actually, the welfare state in Britain does govern the lives of more people than many European countries. And you were proposing to come up basically down to a sort of computer program. And this sort of thing would make HS2 sound like a cakewalk.
Well, it's not as expensive as HS2 for a start, but it does affect, I suppose it does affect more people. It affects them on a daily basis. I agree with you. But
and if you get it wrong, then you know the penalty you pay for that. right? If you're going to 5 million people, even if 50,000 of them get completely mistreated by the system, they're going to be in the headlines, and it creates a huge political fuss.
Of course it does.
The party gets cast as cruel and uncaring and incompetent, and the political penalty paid for that is massive. So what you're attempting to do is, you could not be fraught with more political danger.
Yes, but then what's the point of being in politics if you don't take on the difficult tasks, the dangerous tasks, and solve those problems? I mean, is that what we're